All right, everybody, welcome. Let's jump into it. I am really excited today to be able to introduce Drs. Subramaniam and Kyonka, talking today about ongoing efforts to better understand the degree to which diverse authors and diverse researchers are represented in the behavior analytic literature. There are some really interesting hard data that I think are really interesting here, and I am really excited to hear more about what you guys have found. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, Shawn. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shrinidhi Subramaniam, and I'm co-presenting today with Liz Kyonka. And today we're going to talk about our research attempting to quantify diversity and inclusion in behavior analysis. So we want to thank Rusty for inviting us to speak today and Shawn for chairing the session. Our research was possible because of assistance from graduate students Lou Aginiga and Sadie Detrey, and our undergraduate research assistant Penelope Lee at Stanislaus State. And we also want to acknowledge that we are giving this presentation on the traditional lands of the Nacotchtank and Piscataway peoples. Thank you for letting us honor them for their constant and careful stewardship of this land. All right, like others in the field, we've been interested in issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how they relate to the experimental analysis of behavior. Diversity can be defined as the representation of social identity groups in a work group, organization, or community. And standing here in Washington, D.C. today, I feel it would be weird to go on without acknowledging that this is a dangerous moment in the recent history of the United States, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Among other federal actions, an executive order against DEI has led organizations like the NIH and NSF to scramble. There have been pauses to review panels. People in this room have experienced funding cuts. There have been flags on applications with DEI language, and even keywords like biodiversity are being flagged. Researchers who've been conducting DEI have even been added to databases, and there's a sense that higher education sort of feels unsafe. All of these things are efforts at censorship, and they've been stemming from a false narrative claiming that efforts at improving diversity and inclusion are discriminatory to certain groups. Inclusion is affirmation, celebration, and appreciation of different approaches, styles, perspectives, and experiences, and that's a construct that's central to humanity. So with all that said, I'm going to turn it over to Liz, who's going to tell you a bit more about what we hope to achieve today.
I'm just going to put the mic on. Thanks. So this is what we would like to be the outline of our talk today. We imagined that we would start by telling you who is and who is not included in the scientific community of behavior analysis, how we know who is and is not included, what are some of the barriers to entry for those groups who might not be welcome, and then end on a more positive note with some things that we might be able to do about that. So that was the talk that we wanted to be able to give. However, as with most research, getting answers has been a little bit less straightforward. So instead, this is the talk that we're able to give at this point in time. We are going to start with why one should care about diversity and inclusion in behavior analysis. We'll cover who might or might not be excluded to the extent that we know, and why we don't have a good answer to that question, right? The reasons why identifying underrepresented people and groups is even harder than you might think. We can tell you something about the participation of female authors, international authors, and authors of color in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, or JAB, and how that information has been generated by ourselves and by other people. We will talk about some of the barriers to finding out what we really want to know. And we will really try to end on a hopeful note by discussing some of the things that we can all do to promote inclusion in our scientific community today, with or without the ideal data set that we might want. Okay, so to begin, Why should every behavior analyst care about representation and inclusion in the science of behavior analysis? I'm guessing since you're here in this room, you probably do care. Right? Well, I like to think in metaphor, and this is the metaphor that resonates with me. If I had to live off the land, eating only what I could grow, forage, or hunt, I would want to live near this Three Sisters garden on the right rather than this industrial cornfield on the left. Biodiversity, in spite of what some keyword searches might think, is just better than monoculture. Right? It provides access to more and different nutrients, to clean air and water. It enriches the soil that it grows in, and it regulates pests and disease. And whether you're talking about crops or about science, a more diverse field is a better field. Right? It's more resilient and productive. And as Shrinidhi has already mentioned, diversity requires inclusion. So we wanted to ask some questions about who is and is not included in behavior analysis and the experimental analysis of behavior. We've already acknowledged that we don't really have a clear answer yet, but what we set out to discover was whether there are disparities, specifically for the purposes of this talk, in publication that might highlight potential bias in the field, whether there's been any change in those disparities over time that might signal progress or lack of progress, whether there's any evidence that interventions to increase diversity are necessary, and if so, what kind of interventions do the data that we have specify? All right, we care about quantifying diversity and inclusion and belonging and access and all of the letters in behavior analysis, because increasing diversity can lead to innovation and more diverse outcomes. And quantifying diversity, gathering those data, is important for helping to establish benchmarks. So, okay, so what's the weight? Why aren't we sharing our data and our benchmarks already? Well, there are several reasons why we don't have a clear answer regarding who is and is not included in the experimental analysis of behavior. What follows is a non-exhaustive list. For one thing, important metrics are really hard to identify. For example, teaching and tenure matters, but in ways that are really difficult to quantify. How does teaching a large number of undergraduates on a regular basis compare in terms of impact to mentoring a few PhD students very closely who then might go on to have very influential careers within behavior analysis? We're all here at a conference today. So we think conferences matter, but there are many different ways to participate in conferences. Thinking as quantitative behavior analysts, should we be measuring representation at conferences as the number of presentations delivered? Should it be audience size, applause volume, quality of questions? It's hard to know. Citations matter. Now that's a minefield that I'm not going to say anything more about today, but it also has been a rich topic for analysis in behavior analysis and other fields, and there is a really interesting published literature on it. Peer reviewing matters, but how do we measure the impact of peer review, and how do we assign it to different individuals or identity characteristics in a system that mostly involves at least single-blind review? Journal editing matters, and unlike peer reviewing, editing is a visible activity, but it's not clear to us how it matters and how much. So for example, having your name on a board of editors of a journal can mean a lot of different things. So do we track the honor of having the name on the editorial board, or do we track who does the work of inviting reviewers, soliciting their reviews, trying to get them to submit the reviews that they said they would submit, synthesizing that information and writing decision letters? And our focus today is going to be on publications. We think publications matter, but we know that all authorial contributions are not equal. If you're going to quantify authorship, you need to make some decisions about how to count contributions. Should we be counting number of articles? That's what we're going to talk about today. But maybe it would be better to count the number of pages or the number of experiments. If you look at meta-analyses, what they count is the number of subjects, and that's true in meta-analyses of single case experimental research as much as it is in large and group design research. And in addition to deciding what to count, we need to acknowledge that we need to make decisions about whether and how to incorporate authorship order. So for example, someone who has 9 publications in a particular journal as a sandwich author, so if they're the 3rd of 7 authors or the 14th of 25 authors, I would say has not made the same contribution as someone who has published the same number of first author publications or perhaps as corresponding author publications. Right? So a consensus on the target behaviors that are relevant and the operational definitions of those target behaviors is not going to be easy to come by. And it's not because there's an absence of data or because the relevant behaviors are covert, but rather because there's a glut of potential dependent variables, and all of those potential dependent variables interact with each other in really nuanced ways. What's more, we're not even sure what are the right categories to examine. So just as it's challenging to identify and operationalize target behaviors, it's also a challenge to identify the categories that might be relevant predictor variables. With maybe one exception, and not only is it difficult to identify what they are, once you've identified them, it's difficult to collect data on them. Right? So with maybe one exception that Shrinidhi is going to talk about a little later, very few identity characteristics are directly publicly accessible. You can't see an author's gender or race or sexual identity on the cover page or the first page of a journal article. Right? It is possible for independent observers to make what seem to be reasonable inferences about a few characteristics with some caveats. And there are a whole range of other characteristics that are theoretically straightforward to obtain via self-report. But there are challenges and issues with doing that. And anyway, I suspect that some of the important characteristics would defy demographic categorization. Regardless, there's no standardization in terms of what characteristics are recorded and reported by different journals, conferences, and other sources of data. And even within the same source of data, there's no consistency over time. Individual organizers of each conference, editors of journals, and directors of graduate training programs are doing their best to make educated guesses about the attributes that might be important, and then they're collecting data, recording and reporting those characteristics accordingly. So, in addition to challenges selecting and operationalizing both target behaviors and predictor variables for data analysis, we're not sure what the goal should be. Right? It's not at all clear what diverse enough looks like. Right? And as I was typing that into our slides as we were putting together the talk, I kind of said to myself, like, hold on, Liz, it sounds like you're talking about quotas. So I want to add another caveat here that this is not a quota. But just to give you an example, knowing that 35% of a group are women is not the same as knowing that women are underrepresented within that group. In order to conclude that women are underrepresented, we would need to know a little bit more about what population that group is sampling from. And just a little bit about how a benchmark is not a quota. A benchmark is a point of reference used to measure the performance, quality, or value of something against other things, right? Or the same thing in different contexts or at different time points for the purpose of evaluating progress or effectiveness. What that means is, even if you can conclude that one group of people or one identity characteristic, one category is underrepresented in a particular group relative to the population that you're sampling from, that's not necessarily a problem. We don't expect the proportion of JAB authors who are women or people of color, for example, to exactly match the proportion in the population, if we can even figure out who is the population that JAB is sampling authors from. But if there are sustained and systemic discrepancies in the proportion in JAB versus the proportion in the population JAB is sampling from, it's worth asking why that is. Okay, so I realize we're only a few minutes into the talk, but if I were attending this talk by now, I would probably be thinking, okay, blah, 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 enough, Liz. You've been talking for a little bit. It's time to see some data. But we're actually going to make you do a little bit of work before we show you some data. So what I'd like you to do, please, is scan the QR code. And this is going to take you to a Mentimeter poll asking who you think publishes the most as first author, or if you just want to make a guess about any authorship in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior. And our data are based in the last 25 years, so since 2000. Who do you think has published the most in JAB? So if you scan the QR code, then if you would please type their last name, and I think it gives you an option to enter up to 3 names, so if you want to hedge your bets a little bit, or you want to, what is it called in gambling when you pick the top 3 and they can appear in any order? Nobody else is a gambling researcher, so that's fair. Something that I should know.
And if you don't have someone to write down, just make up some names.
Yeah, or put your own name.
Self-nominate.
Yeah. It looks like folks are still scanning the QR code, so I'll give you another minute to do that. Okay. Okay, I'm impressed. I see a lot of Baum. I see a lot of correct guesses here, actually. Is anyone still entering names? Okay. Oh, I want to go back to this one, don't I? So these are pictures of the 11 people with the most first author publications in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior this century, with 11 articles apiece. And I erased the little list that we had, but let's see if I can do this from memory. Does everyone know who these people are? Billy Baum, McDowell, good. Andy Craig, Tim Shahan. That's Mike Davison. Peter, Chris Podlesnik, yep, Jim Mazur, Andy Littell, and then Randy Grace and Toshi Kuroda were tied for 10th, so tied for 11th with 11 first authored articles apiece. So these are the most frequent first authors in JAB. But of this group, half of them, so 5 of them, were also among the 10 people with the most last author publications in the same time period. And a slightly different half were also among the 13 people, 13 because ties, 13 people who published the most solo author publications during that time. So altogether, these 11 gentlemen, you'll notice there are no women on this list, were the first, last, or only author of more than 15% of the 1,397 articles we coded that have been published in JAB between January 2000 and January 2025 or November 2024. All right, so knowing who does publish in JAB is not the same as knowing who is not included in JAB, but it does seem like people who are not American-educated white men are kind of underrepresented, at least on this top 10 list. And of the 21 people on all 3 of those lists, so the first, last, and only, all but 1 of them were male, and I'm confident about that. And to the best of my knowledge, all but 1 are non-Latin white people. All right, so now you might be thinking that you didn't come to a squab tutorial for anecdata. So next we're going to talk about some published results. We're not the first to comment on gender and participation in behavior analysis. Right? In fact, there are at least 6 published articles that have reported on the proportion of women as first authors in JAB. The methods that these folks used were quite different from the methods that we used, but collectively they cover most of JAB's history. So in the first study evaluating participation by women, Poling et al. In 1983 covered the proportion of women as first authors from JAB's inception in 1958 through 1981. Vic Ladies published a sort of retrospective of the Society for the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, which publishes JAB and JABA, and it included an analysis of the proportion of women as first authors in JAB that covered through 1987, and then Myers in 1993 extended those reports through 1992. McSweeney and Swindell, 1998, was the first article reporting on women first authors that was written by a woman first author. And perhaps not coincidentally, it was the first such article to include a method section. McSweeney and Swindell covered 1978 to 1997. And then there's a little bit of a gap, which we are mostly going to fill. And then Lee and colleagues and Rata and colleagues examined women as first authors in JAB and a bunch of other behavior analysis journals, among other behaviors, in 2014 to 2017 and 2017 to 2020, respectively. Okay, we're going to show you some of their results, and then we'll tell you about how they obtained the data. So eventually, this graph is going to show the percentage of JAB articles that are estimated to have a woman first author from 1958 all the way to 2024. Each of these data points is pooled across 4 or 5 year intervals, depending on what the individual authors did. All right, so here's Poling et al. 1983 estimated that only 4% of articles published in the first 5 years of JAB had a woman first author. And then over the next 20 years, participation by women doubled, yay, to a little bit more than 8%, maybe not so yay. According to McSweeney and Swindell, articles with women first authors increased from about 10% to about 15% between 1978 and 1997. And then Lee et al. And Rata et al. Provided more recent estimates of women first authors in JAB, specifically 32% from 2014 to 17 and 28% from 2017 to 2020. And looking across these 4 year intervals and thinking about that sort of all-time high of 32%, that represents a 7 to 8-fold increase in the proportion of women who are first authors of JAB articles since JAB's first 5 years. Next, I'm going to turn it over to Shrinidhi, who will present work that others have published on other characteristics than gender.
Thanks, Liz. Right, so as you saw, there's quite a bit of research on the participation of women in behavior analysis, but we know a lot less about other author characteristics like race and ethnicity. Some researchers have looked at institutional affiliation and author surnames to infer some of these characteristics. So Diamond, 1997, and Curiel 2022 looked at author affiliations in JAB from 1958 to 2020. And Lee and colleagues replicated that work and conducted a surname analysis to estimate participation by Latina Hispanic women in JAB from 1997 to 2022. And this graph is structured a lot like the last graph, with the percentage of articles in JAB with authors who have affiliations outside of North America on the primary y-axis and years across the x-axis. And each data point is going to represent percentages pooled across 5 year intervals. So Diamond found that only 2% of articles in the first 5 years of JAB were by authors outside of North America. That value increased to 25% of articles in the early to mid 90s. And then Curiel showed that participation stabilized at around 21% from the late 90s to 2020. Outside of North America, articles with author affiliations from European or Australasian regions were most common. And they also looked at cooperative articles, articles with author affiliations from 2 or more regions, which increased from 1% of articles in the first 5 years of JAB to 12% in the most recent analysis. Now I'm adding a secondary y-axis that shows the number of women authors in JAB with the matching Hispanic surname. And these are data from Lee and colleagues. They found an increase in the number of researchers who have contributed to JAB from 1997 to 2022. And the increase was fairly steady, but the absolute number of Latina authors in JAB remains low at 23 people in the last 5 years. Okay, we told you what they found. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what they did. So for the most part, these studies assigned gender and ethnicity using human researchers as coders. Researchers looked at all of the author names and estimated the author's gender by coding them as women or men, depending on common usage of the name. The more recent studies also searched for those authors on the internet and looked up whether their pronouns were listed. To infer whether authors were Hispanic Latina, Lee et al. Conducted a surname analysis using the US Census Spanish surname list. The list wasn't exhaustive, so they also reached out to editorial members and asked them to disclose identity information so that they could do some research and add to the list. To our knowledge, this is the only study of participation in JAB where researchers asked authors to self-disclose identity information, and that's noteworthy. But while they did ask, the people they asked were editorial members and not every single author on the list. International affiliations were more straightforward. Researchers use addresses of listed affiliations to assign authors to 6 regions of the world. So there was North America, Australasia, East Asia, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, and cooperative. These human transduced methods have a lot of advantages. So they have historical precedent, they're non-invasive, and they use inter-observer agreement to measure the believability of the outcomes. However, the characteristics assigned to authors are impacted by the experiences and the biases of human observers. Many of the past studies that we mentioned were conducted by researchers in the global Northwest. And since I've been in the US, I haven't met a lot of folks who know a Shrinidhi, so I'm usually the first Shrinidhi they meet. Would they know what to do with my name if they saw that on a list, or other names that are common in other regions? All of these methods also adhere to a gender binary, and they can miss important categories like intersex, non-binary, and transgendered people. And while estimating race and ethnicity has all the same issues of misclassification as estimating gender, there hasn't been a thoroughgoing analysis of author race. So we've been exploring the use of automated tools to quantify diversity in behavior analysis. These tools get by some of the issues with using humans to code gender and ethnicity. Specifically, we've been using the open source CleanBib tool by Zhao and colleagues. CleanBib uses gender API and ethnicolor databases to probabilistically assign gender and ethnicity to first and last author pairs in a bibliography entry. And it was developed by these authors to allow researchers to construct a citation diversity statement for their paper's reference list. As I mentioned, CleanBib uses gender API and ethnicolor databases to generate predictions for each author's gender and ethnicity. Gender API has cataloged over 6 million names from 191 countries, and researchers in neuroscience have found that it has a 96% accuracy with individual authors. And the Ethnicolor database uses US Census data, Wikipedia data, and Florida voter registration data to estimate race and ethnicity as either white, Hispanic, Black, Asian, or some other race ethnicity. Researchers have found that Ethnicolor predicts race and ethnicity with about 85% accuracy. So there are a lot of pros to CleanBib. It has capacity, it has scalability, it has consistency, but like with the human transduced data, the tool still adheres to that gender binary. It relies on convention, and it can give us a sense of the perceived or likely characteristics of an author, but not necessarily their true identity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. CleanBib is run in a Python environment. Again, this is not our code. It's a publicly available tool to evaluate citation diversity. And because it's formatted for citation diversity, the tool only looks at first author and last authors of a given publication. Since this is a tutorial, we want to walk you through some of the steps on how to use this tool as we illustrate our method. So we input a .bib file containing bibliography entries for a single issue of JAB. Then we simply ran the cleanbib program. Within the program, we ran code blocks to import functions to exclude any authors, which we didn't. And the program then generates a list of first and last authors for each article in the issue. We used our unique gender API key to run the analysis, and then we ran some more code. And voila, the program generates and prints a citation diversity statement and some neat figures. If you want to see a model of a citation diversity statement, you can see our paper in JAB from last year. We used this tool to generate one. So importantly, this program gives us a predictions file with key information. It gives us gender categories of each first and last author with proportions representing confidence scores, and confidence proportions for whether the author is estimated to be white or a person of color. We used a greater than 0.5 probability cutoff to assign estimated race and ethnicity as white or a person of color. So I'm showing the predictions file for the January 2000 issue of JAB, which had 7 articles. Each article had a first and a last author. Gender API estimated that Neil Dugdale is a man with 99% confidence and white with 95% confidence. Juliana Lancaster was estimated to be a woman with 98% confidence and white with 54% confidence. So we conducted this analysis with all first and last authors for each issue of JAB from 2000 to 2024. And for the purposes of this talk, we will share data on first authors only and pool the results on gender and ethnicity in 5-year intervals. We want to be clear that cleanbib's accuracy is limited and there's potential for misclassification. It relies on mostly Western convention, and some people have identities that are not appropriately captured by this method. For example, my name Shrinidhi is more likely to be a man with 67% confidence. Len Green is more likely to be a person of color with 54% confidence. Lanny Fields is more likely to be a woman with 59% confidence. And Valdeep Saini is more likely to be white with 54% confidence. We were curious about the distributions of these confidence scores for our first author's gender, that's shown on the left, and race ethnicity, shown on the right. Please forgive our wildly different y-axis scales on the histograms, but as you might expect, Gender API classified first names with a high degree of confidence, and Ethnicolor API assigned much lower probabilities to first and last names as being white or a person of color, and that's consistent with previous research. Okay, now for some results. This graph shows the proportion of first authors who were women as estimated by Gender API used by cleanbib. And we can compare our estimates to the published research on women first authors in JAB that I showed you earlier. With the caveats that the method and the pooling window are different, it's clear that participation by women as first authors is increasing. So from the 50s through the 70s, an average of 6.5% of articles were authored by women. This value doubled to 13% in the 80s and 90s, and more than doubled to 28% in the 28th century. I'm skipping ahead, the 21st century. Another thing we noticed was that estimations of gender API were very close to Lee et al. And Rata et al. 2024 for their 4-year intervals. Here we're showing participation by people of color. We're collapsing across gender, and these estimates come from the Ethnicolor database used by cleanbib. Participation by people of color has been slowly increasing over the past 25 years, from 10% of articles in the early 2000s, more than doubling to 23% in the last 5 years. And when we compare our results to previous research, well, we can't, because there have been no published studies estimating race and ethnicity in all JAB first authors, and this is something we're working on. cleanbib generated data that allowed us to consider interactions of race and ethnicity and gender. Here I'm showing the percentage of articles estimated to be authored by white women, shown as the filled squares, men of color, shown as the orange circles, and women of color, shown as the orange squares. And when we pool across the last century, the percentage of articles estimated to be authored by white women was 2 times and 4 times higher than men of color and women of color, respectively. All percentages are increasing at about the same rate, with the percentage of articles by white women increasing at a slightly higher rate. Okay, so far we've talked about trends in first authorship by women and people of color in JAB over the last 25 years. We saw that women comprise a much higher percentage of first authors than previous decades, 33% of articles in the last 5 years compared to 4% of articles at the beginning of JAB. We also saw that participation by people of color has been increasing to 23% of articles in the last 5 years. It's important to note that more articles have been published in the last decade, so increased participation by some groups doesn't equal decreased participation by other groups. There have been some persistent gaps. Women of color first authors comprise the lowest proportion of articles at only 9%. So we showed you earlier who published the most articles in JAB, a group of mostly white American educated men. We wanted to know how many unique researchers are publishing, how much they're publishing, and how often women and people of color are publishing. So Liz is going to come up and tell you more about that.
All right, thank you. So our analysis identified 1,104 unique authors across all first and last author pairs. That means out of the 1,397 articles we examined, we looked at the first and last author of each, and that consisted of 1,104 different people. 734 of those were first authors. CleanBib estimated that 63% were men and almost 80% were white. This pie chart shows breakdowns across all demographic categories that we looked at. Over half of first authors were estimated to be white men, 29% white women, 12% estimated to be men of color, and 8% estimated to be women of color. The top bar graph here shows the total number of articles and the number of unique first authors in parentheses for each of those 4 demographic categories. The bottom bar graph regraphs that information as the mean of the number of articles written by each author. So on average, authors estimated to be white men published 2.26 first authored articles in the 25-year period. So someone who's estimated to be a white man who published once in JAB after the year 2000 was pretty likely to publish again. Estimated male authors of color published 1.84 articles each. White women published 1.5 articles each, and then women of color published 1.15 articles each, which suggests that women of color who do publish in JAB are much less likely than other groups to publish in JAB again. Solo authored papers might represent a more prestigious category of research because they signal that a single author was responsible for the full intellectual contribution, from conceptualization to analysis and writing. Solo authored papers can indicate a high level of expertise, of independence, and perhaps of recognition within behavior analysis. Since 2000, JAB has published 288 solo authored papers by 150 different authors. Of those papers, 85% were estimated to be authored by white men, 8% by men of color, 6% by white women, and only 1% by women of color. We also found it interesting that the average number of solo authored JAB articles written by each man was either a little bit above or a little bit below 2, but in the last quarter century, there's only been one woman who has solo authored more than one JAB paper. Right? And that difference between men and women was preserved across the white author of color groups. So what does all this mean? Well, the proportion of first authors in JAB who are estimated to be women has grown steadily since 1958, and it shows no sign of slowing down. Yet, even after 60 years of growth, women are underrepresented relative to the general US adult population, relative to college graduates working in STEM, I'm supposed to have a box there, relative to faculty in higher education in general, and relative to psychology faculty in the United States. The estimated proportions of JAB authors who are not white are likely less precise. And I do want to acknowledge that non-white is a particularly crude and blunt instrument to measure race ethnicity to begin with. We don't have any other studies to compare this to. We had to start somewhere. But that proportion of non-white authors in JAB does seem to be on the rise. Based on the most recent 5-year estimate, first authors of color are somewhat underrepresented in JAB relative to college graduates working in STEM, higher ed faculty, and the general US population. They don't seem to be underrepresented relative to people of color in US psychology faculty. And while we need to be skeptical about the accuracy, reliability, and validity of each of these numbers, and I need to acknowledge that psychology faculty are probably not quite the population that JAB samples its authors from, I do think these results suggest that if we are interested in the controlling variables that determine the proportion of authors of color in JAB, it might be relevant to ask some questions about who has access to advanced graduate training, academic jobs, and tenure in behavior analysis. All right, when speculating about the dearth of women on JAB's editorial board in 1987, Vic Ladies wrote the following comment. The problem appears not to be related to the journal, but rather in obtaining satisfactory academic jobs. And on the one hand, this sounds a little patronizing to me. Like, oh, those dames, they just couldn't get a good academic job. But to the extent that this is probably, this observation probably applies as much to people of color writing in JAB today as it did to women serving on the editorial board in JAB in the 1980s. And I know we just spent some time presenting a bunch of data, and the talk is about quantifying diversity, but I want to share something that I wanted to include in this article that we published in JAB last year, but it ended up getting cut, let's say for length, maybe not just for length. So there's a section in this paper about measuring representation in behavior analysis, and the initial submission, the conclusion of that section ended with this. When it comes to broadening representation, behavior analysis in general and EAB, experimental analysis of behavior in particular, still have a long way to go. And then I had a long line of citations. I wanted to make the case that we have enough baseline data. It's time to make sustained systemic efforts to encourage more and different people to pursue and participate in the basic science of behavior analysis. And I do feel a little bit conflicted about that because as behavior analysts, as quantitative scientists, we always want more data. But at the same time, I don't think the absence of a perfect data set should prevent us from attempting to move forward. So, as promised, we want to talk about ways to increase participation, right? So one way to do what I wanted to recommend that we do, that is to make sustained efforts to encourage more and different people to pursue the basic science of behavior analysis, is to be behavior analysts, right? To do behavior analysis and subject our own scientific and professional behavior to behavior analytic methods, right? So what do I mean by behavior analytic methods? I just mean what you always do, right? Start by identifying a target behavior, whether that's publishing, presenting, citing, doing editorial work. Then conduct a functional assessment that considers the roles of institutions and individuals in determining the controlling variables of those activities. Why do we publish where we do? Why do we cite who we do? And also thinking about what are the barriers, right? Just as when you conduct a functional assessment for a problem behavior, you're thinking about what determines the rate of the competing behavior or the alternative behavior as well as for the target behavior. Right? Why are we doing what we do? And then using that information to develop ideas about possible interventions implementing those interventions, assessing their effectiveness, and revising them in data-informed ways. And I realize that's a lot to put in one box of one arrow. But the impression that I get from my applied colleagues is that if you get these first two right, you identify the right target behavior, and you do a thorough, accurate, and effective functional assessment, the intervention part gets way easier. Right. It's really exciting to me to see so many people incorporating these types of questions about diversity, equity, inclusion, all the letters, into their research programs. But you don't have to be part of a lab or planning to get a publication to do this type of work. For example, I'm confident that everyone who's in this room is in contact with behavior analytics scholarly literature. Is that right? Yeah. I'm also pretty confident, very confident, that none of you read every single behavior analysis article the instant that it's published. Is that right? Right? Yeah, and that's a good thing. There is more behavior analytic research being published every minute of every day than any one person could possibly keep up with, right? And what that means is we all have to forage selectively in the patches of behavior analytic literature, right? Out of necessity. So that means that we all make decisions about what are we going to read, what are we going to skip, what are we going to skim, what are we going to look at really carefully and deeply. And just as keeping a food diary often reveals that people don't eat the things that they think they eat or the quantities that they think they eat, I bet a little systematic observation would illuminate some controlling variables that have nothing to do with the content of the article, right? You probably decide what to read and when to read it based in part on where it's published. Do you know who the authors are? How popular is the article? Maybe measured in terms of citations, maybe measured in terms of article downloads. And then I bet response effort has a lot to do with it, right? How many clicks or how much money does it take to access the full text? Where does it appear on the website? I talked about this with my undergraduate students in my lab last semester when I was on sabbatical, and one of them said, yeah, you know, I have to write papers for classes all the time, and I never think about how to cite, which articles I should be citing. I just type something into PsycInfo or Google Scholar, and I pick the articles that are at the top of the list. Nobody likes to scroll. All right, if this kind of simple, informal, functional assessment reveals an imbalance in your reading diet, as a behavior analyst, you're already well equipped to modify that behavior. And just as a semi-related example, about once a year, I do a little mini experiment on my leisure reading, usually in June after my grades are entered, conference is done, and I have a little bit of time to think about things like that. So for a month, I'll read, for example, only Afrofuturism in my leisure reading, or I'll make an effort to incorporate more poetry. I'm not 100% successful at changing my reading habits, and I don't change them to the same degree every year. I've continued to read a lot more Afrofuturist sci-fi novels than I have poetry, and that's just how it's going to be, and I'm okay with that. But a relatively short period, conducting a little intervention for a relatively short period of time that requires a relatively low effort often has a large and enduring impact on not only what I choose to read, but also the search algorithms that I use in my phone to decide what am I going to read next. Right? And I think that varying our diet of scientific articles could really be as easy as that. And if you are someone who does academic behavior analysis research, we published a long and extensively researched article that specifies a number of tactics you might use to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, access, justice, all the letters. We're not going to go through all of these, but the article is available to anyone who wants access to it. Please just let us know. And I do want to talk about incorporating reflexive practices. So incorporating reflexive practices into your reading and citing behavior is not different or more effortful than the process I just described, right? I'm not suggesting that you try and do it for 100% of the articles that you write, But for example, most introductions have a paragraph where you're citing some evidence that your topic, whatever it is, has already been cited extensively or been studied extensively, but not, of course, in the fantastically creative and novel way that you are about to present in your paper. So how do you choose from among those thousands of articles a select few as examples of relevant previous research? I suspect that making a point of choosing to elevate the work of someone who might otherwise be underrepresented isn't going to be that much more work on your part. If you're only doing it once or twice per article. But if each of us did that once or twice in every article we submitted to JAB, I bet there would be a noticeable difference in citation patterns, in visibility, and in things like that before very long. All right, as we enjoy our ABAI experience this year, we can engage in simple reflexive practice by asking questions like,
Okay, why am I attending this conference?
What sessions do I choose to attend?
Whose voices are centered or missing?
And how does my background shape what I notice?
We hope that practicing self-reflection leads you to think about the status quo in behavior analysis, where you think it needs to change, and what you can do to challenge it. And we want to thank you for joining us today. In the spirit of open dialogue, we've included another QR code, but this time it leads to a form where you can ask us questions, give us comments or feedback, either anonymously or with your contact information. You can go ahead and open the form now and submit it whenever you want.
Thank you so much for your time and attention.